So I think a few people will kind of come in as they get their coffee and so forth. So but let's go ahead and get started. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Chen Li. Chen Li is right now a Miller Research postdoc at UC Berkeley, working with Professor Robert Folk, who actually I'm a postdoc with. And before that, Dr. Li did his PhD working with a physicist by the name of Dan Goldman, who studied terrestrial mechanics, and I think we're going to learn a nice mix of those things in your seminar today. So let's welcome Chen.
Thanks, Noah, for the nice introduction, and thanks everyone for having me here. So today I'm going to tell you about my research on the terradynamics and bio-inspired robotics for movement in complex terrain. So animals can move amazingly well in all sorts of natural terrain. As you can see, material like sand and soil, these little reptiles and rodents are having no trouble running rapidly, whereas this little cockroach below here is also having no trouble going through a very dense patch of grass, which is a three-dimensional terrain with multiple obstacles. And today, similar to the emergence of personal computers a few decades ago, robots are emerging as a major part of society with many potential applications, as you see here. Especially over the last couple of decades, we have seen a burst of mobile robots that are beginning to go into the real world. However, if you ask any roboticist, including the ones here, I think we would all agree that even our best mobile robots are compared to the amazing mobility that animals display. They still don't move quite so well in complex terrain. And one of the main challenges that has limited our understanding of biological movement as well as advancement of robotic mobility in complex terrain is that compared to the movement in air and water, where we have well-established theoretical models as well as computational models and well-established experimental tools such as wind tunnel and water channel, our understanding of terrestrial movement has largely been limited to that on simplified grounds such as solid rigid surfaces where you have close to non-slip point contact. In other words, compared to the well-established aero and hydrodynamics, we don't have terradynamics for understanding and advancing mobility in complex terrain. And my research aims to begin to address this problem by creating terradynamics. To do so, I take an interdisciplinary approach, integrating engineering, biology, and physics studies. So in the rest of my talk, I will show you how I can use engineering tools to enable precise and systematic experiments. With these tools, I can then study animal and robot movement to reveal capabilities and limits of locomotion in complex terrain. Using these experimental tools and based on these insights, I then study the physics of contact mechanics to extract general principles and derive quantitative predictive models. These principles and models will allow me to will provide design tools and control rules to advance mobile robots. In addition, they will provide mechanistic explanation of the amazing mobility of animal movement in complex terrain, which in turn provide inspirations for mobile robots. So through the rest of my talk, I will tell you four main aspects of my research, and tomorrow in my chalk talk, I will focus on talking about one major thrust of my future direction. So first, let me tell you how I can begin to quantify the challenge of robot-environment interaction by using controlled granular media as the next step to define the environment. So the study of movement on terrestrial media such as sand, soil, mud, and snow that can flow in response to locomotion is not a new problem. In fact, an entire field called terramechanics has been developed over the last few decades that has advanced the design of such large wheel and tracked vehicles. And if you look at these pictures, you can see that the ground interface of these large vehicles usually have a small curvature, meaning that the sinkage of the vehicle is small relative to the size of the vehicle. It is due to this fact that in the development of these terramechanical models, approximation called horizontal plane approximation has been prevalent. Essentially, by approximating this vehicle ground interface using a horizontal plate, indenting the surface downward, one can then measure the pressure versus depth relationship in the vertical direction and use that to predict the lift on the vehicle. By balancing the lift with the vehicle weight, one can then predict the sinkage. This is in the vertical direction, and in principle, you can also do the same in the horizontal direction. However, it is also because of this horizontal plate approximation that such terramechanical models do not work so well when your ground interface curvature becomes large. For example, when your sinkage is large relative to the size of the wheel. In this case, such terramechanical models will over-predict lift and under-predict sinkage, and these have catastrophic consequences, such as the Mars rover Spirit, which become permanently stuck on the surface of loose Martian soil. It is also because of this limitation that we do not expect such terramechanical models to work for a legged locomotion, where the ground interaction is much more complex, as you can see here. And in recent years, many studies have tried to resolve this limitation by studying small wheels in the lab and systematically controlling and varying the parameters of wheels. However, much less attention has been paid to controlling the ground. And in fact, in the majority of terramechanical studies, the ground is prepared using simple tools such as a shovel or a rake by going back and forth. And people have, in fact, come up with up to 10 steps of protocols how to use these tools to prepare the material. So when I first began thinking about how to understand animal biological and robotic movement on such flowable ground, I decided to take a slightly different approach. So first, I picked dry granular media as a simple starting point. Dry granular media, such as sand and gravel, are collections of discrete particles that interact through dissipative repulsive contact forces. I picked them because, as you see here, granular media can flow and resolidify, representing such flowable media. But compared to these other ones, such as soil, mud, and snow, they are relatively simple because they're more uniform and they have no cohesion. But even for dry granular media, if you look at this picture of the sand dune, you can see that it can still be very complex. You can have uneven and sloped surfaces with variable compaction from loosely packed to closely packed state. To control granular media better, I created this device called the Fluidized Bed. Essentially what it does is it sends a large flow of air upward through the particles, and the particles will become fluidized. As the air is turned off, the particles will deposit into a loosely packed state. And then I can send repeated air pulses or mechanical vibrations to compact the particles gradually up to the closely packed state. So with this device, analogous to the wind tunnel or a water channel, I can enable precise control and systematic variation. Yes?
When you change the packing rate, what's the range? Like, are you approaching jamming condition? What's the range of the packing rate?
So in nature, the loosely packed state can be as low as about 56% in terms of volume fraction. That's the solid volume divided by the total volume, and up to about 64%. So with my fluidized bed, I can control it to from about 57 to 63, so a little bit less than the natural, but covering the majority of it. Yes. And in fact, such control of the ground is important because, for example, if I measure the yield force that I generate by pushing an object into granular media with everything else the same, simply varying compaction, I found that the yield force can increase by up to 5 times. Now, with my device to precisely control the ground, I then use a legged robot to also precisely control and systematically vary the parameters of the locomotor. So here's the robot that I used, called Rex, developed by Dan Kotochek's group at UPenn. As you can see, it has 6 legs, and using alternating tripod gait to run rapidly on solid ground, inspired from a running cockroach. Now, with this robot, I can control locomotor parameters such as the leg frequency, as you can see here. And if you look at one of the video, you can see that during each leg cycle, the leg will move faster during the aerial phase and then slow down during the ground contact phase. And in fact, this diagram shown here is the leg phasing that's tuned to generate such rapid movement on solid ground. Well, this empirically tuned leg phasing worked for granular media. When I first tested this robot, I used this leg phasing and run the robot on closely packed granular media. And as you can see, the robot goes nowhere and fails to move. Then, by empirical adjustment of the leg phasing, essentially here I brought forward the slow phase during each cycle. With everything else the same, you can see that now the robot can move at speeds of up to 1 body length per second. So the ground really matters. You can't simply expect that the parameters that you tune to generate motion on one type of surface to work on another. In addition, if I use this now leg phasing that's tuned for granular media, and if I rotate the legs a little bit faster or make the ground a little bit less compact, then the robot would transition back to failure to move. And if I do the opposite, then the robot can recover movement. And I have systematically tested the speed of the robot as a function of these 3 parameters, including ground compaction, leg phasing, and leg frequency, and found very sensitive dependence on robot speed on all these parameters. I have also developed a kinematic model with tube model fitting parameter that capture the experimental observation. I won't go into the details of these data, but I'll tell you in a nutshell what's governing the movement to failure transition. So for that, I will first introduce the yield criterion for granular media or ground that can flow in general. When you move an object in such flowable media, if the force that you apply on the object is greater than the yield force of the material, then the particles will fluidize or they will yield. And conversely, if the yield force is greater than the applied force, then they will resolidify. So now, given this, I can then measure the yield force on a robot leg that's rotating through granular media. So here is the video. You can see that I'm rotating this robot leg about a fixed axle through granular media. Because this axle is fixed, the force that I measure is the yield force because the material is continuously yielding during this process. And here is the force that I measured in the experiment and a simple sketch to show the force. So as the leg rotates through granular media, when the leg first contacts the surface, then your yield force will start to develop and increase. And then during the leg cycle, the force will peak and then decrease. And this is the yield force in the vertical direction. Now, for a robot that moves on the surface, its motor axle is not fixed, but free to move up and down depending on force balance. So you have, on the robot axle, you have applied force, which is the weight of the robot, plus an inertial force that accelerates its leg upward. So now, during each leg cycle, initially your yield force is still developing and not enough to balance the applied force. So from the yield criterion, you know that in this process, the particles will fluidize and yield. So the leg will move through particles while the body sits on the surface. As soon as your yield force is large enough to balance the applied force, then the particles underneath the leg will solidify. So at this point, the leg will start rotating on top of this solid region of the particle, and that lifts the body and propels it forward. And finally, as the yield force drops, the leg again moves through fluidized particles. So it is this region where you have enough yield force to provide the applied force, or in other words, you have solidification of the particles that movement can be generated. And recall I have mentioned that the yield force in granular media I found to increase with the compaction of the material. What this means is that when I make the ground less compact, then the yield force will decrease. Whereas when I rotate the legs faster, or if I make the legs rotate during the fast phase in ground contact, then the applied force would increase because the inertial force would increase. So what this means is that as I make the ground less and less compact and the robot leg frequency faster or moving in fast phase, then at some point you would have applied force that's so great and yield force that's so small that you never have enough yield force to balance the applied force. And in this case, during this entire leg cycle, the leg would continue to move through fluidized particles, and the robot fails to gain a foothold and move forward. So it is so for failure to move, it is the fluidization, continuous fluidization that results in failure. So now with these principled understanding of the transition between movement to failure, I can in future apply these understanding to enable adjustment of robot using sensory and motor feedback. For example, here is a video showing the idea. So here is the granular media, and initially I can, yes?
I'm sorry, with your discussion about this yield force, it seems to me that you're focusing on the force in the vertical direction. But what propels the vehicle is the force in the horizontal direction.
Yes.
So why are they related?
Okay, so over here, in this case of the robot, it is because, as I showed in this second regime, if you watch closely, when this particle becomes solid, then the leg would rotate on top of this solid region about roughly its geometric center, and that will lift the body and propel it forward. So in this case, the movement is kinematic. So you have essentially a solid foothold around here, a virtual foothold.
Well, that's because of the shape of the feet.
Yes. But
So you're neglecting the inertial forces. So the fore-aft force, once you're above the ground, the fore-aft force to move forward is quite negligible. Am I understanding that right? So because it's kinematic motion, you're sort of treating this as a non-inertial regime in terms of the inertia of the robot. So once its body is up off the ground, it's a low amount of torque required to move it forward, and it's mostly about sort of providing enough vertical force to keep it off the ground.
In a simple sense, yes. But as I'll show you in the third section, I can through systematic study of forces, I can really enable prediction of forces and movement. I'll get into that briefly. Yes. Yeah. So here, so I prepare the granular media into a loosely packed state, and then on this initial region, I manually compact it to more compact state. So what you'll see is that initially, with a high light frequency, the robot is able to move fast in this region. And then as soon as it hits the loose region, it will start to slip and fail. What I can then do is slow down the light frequency to ensure that during each cycle, there's a phase where you have enough yield force to balance the applied force and then recover movement. So in the future, I can use these understanding to further study this by using arrays of fluidized bed to enable spatial and temporal variation of ground properties, and then add sensors and develop a ground model-based control to feedback control to enable adaptation of the robot on variable granular surface. So next, I'll tell you with my experimental tools how I can also begin to understand food function in biology, in which I found that the animal uses distinct food function for different types of ground. So there are a variety of animals that live in desert and beach environment that can move very well on granular surfaces. So for example, here is an animal about 10 centimeters long. It's called zebra tail lizard, and it's one of the fastest running animal, a lizard of its size. And just to give you an idea of how fast this animal runs, here's a real-time video. You can see that the animal just disappears in the blink of an eye. In fact, field observation by looking at footprint has estimated that the animal can run on both a solid and granular surface at up to 50 body lengths per second. And people have also come up with functional morphology hypotheses. For example, this animal among its close relatives, it has the most elongated hind foot, which is about half the length from of its body measured from the head to its vent. And people have hypothesized that such elongated hind foot contribute to the animal's high running performance, but still still we don't have a mechanistic explanation of why this is. So to begin to advance this understanding, I then worked with my collaborator Tanya Shea to collect these animals in the desert and then bring them into the lab. So I studied the running of this animal on both solid and granular surface and found that the animal's speed doesn't slow down as ground changes from solid to granular, both at about 20 body lengths per second. But I found that to do so, the animal uses quite distinct foot function. So on solid ground, what I found is that the animal's feet serves as an energy-saving spring. If you watch the animal's foot-ground interaction, which you'll see in a moment, you can see that during each stride, the animal touches down on the surface only using the very tip of its toes, and then the toes will stay in contact while the rest of the foot and leg pivots about the fixed contact. And then by looking into the anatomy of the foot, I found that the animal had very long tendons that span the entire length of its hind foot. But in the lower leg, there are only muscles but no tendons. In addition, it is well known from the literature that during running on solid ground, lower leg muscles will contract almost isometrically and do not deform significantly, whereas the majority of the deformation occurs in the much less stiff tendons. So with this knowledge, I then model the animal leg using a simple model. So the lower leg muscles are a strut that transmit force, whereas the tendons in the foot are a spring. Then from my high-speed video, from my 3D-dimensional kinematics, I can then quantify the curvature of the foot and estimate the deformation of the foot tendon. So that gives me an estimate of how much elastic energy is stored in the foot during mid-stance and then released. So from this study, I found that on solid ground, the animal's foot can save about 40% of the mechanical work needed otherwise. On granular surface, while the animal can maintain a similar running performance, I found that its foot instead serves as a dissipative force-generating paddle. So if you look at the animal's foot-ground interaction, you can see that during each step, the animal will hit the surface with a horizontal foot posture, maximizing the foot area. And then from X-ray experiments, I found that the foot rotates by about 90 degrees subsurface. So now with a simple force model that balances force in the vertical direction, balances the ground reaction force to the weight of the animal, I can then estimate the ground reaction force. And that well captures the center of mass dynamics in the vertical direction. Now with my force estimates, I can further estimate how much mechanical energy is dissipated into the granular media due to plastic deformation. And here what I found is instead the animal leg must do 3 times mechanical work as compared to on solid ground. In addition, these experimental tools can also allow me to begin to look at how animals adjust their foot function when the ground changes. For example, in preliminary experiments running the animal from solid ground to granular media and vice versa, I found that the animal adjusts its foot strategy only after one single step on the new surface. In the future, I would like to look at these sensory motor feedback mechanisms in animals in more detail to help advance mobile robots.
That's a surprising difference in the amount of work required to see no difference in the speed.
Yes.
Did you try to do anything, or did your colleagues, biology colleagues, try to do anything like measure the oxygen respiration rate or something like that to see if they're burning more calories, or like is there any difference in functional capability
Yes.
effect of this additional increase in mechanical work?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we have not done oxygen measurement, but one thing I have looked at, for example, is I looked at how much the knee angle is extending during each step, and I found that on solid ground the knee extends about 40 to 50 degrees, whereas on granular media it extends probably around 120 degrees. So the extension is much larger. So it's very likely that the animal is doing actively doing more work. And also, if you look at the animal's body orientation, on solid ground, the animal's body is roughly horizontal during running, whereas on granular surface, the animal's body pitches up because its hip is lower and its feet sinks in. So it's probably also doing an active adjustment there.
But the related question is what's the ratio of energy of its metabolism or whatever energy it has available? How much is it using to run? Is it 5%? Is it 50%?
Yeah. So I don't have an answer for that. But in fact, so one of my lab mates in my PhD lab, she has more recently studied these animals running on fluidized sand, so with airflow. So in fact, the particles are fluidized, and if you measure yield force, it's essentially zero. But these animals their running speed only drops by about 15 to 20%. They can still run quite well. Yeah, so having told you how with my experimental tools, I can precisely and systematically study robot and animal movement on granular media, I will then tell you how I created the first terradynamic model using the resistive force theory to enable prediction of forces and movement on flowable ground like granular media. So you have seen that the ability to move on granular surface is highly dependent on how much ground reaction force you can generate. And you have also seen that the leg or foot interaction with granular media during locomotion is highly complex. How can we begin to predict forces? So let's take a closer look at the animal and robot's leg or foot interaction with the ground. You can see if you focus on, if you divide each leg or foot into small elements shown in these gray bars, you can see that each element have a depth, is at a depth, and has an orientation as well as a movement direction indicated by arrows that are all different from each other. In addition, if you look at how they move over time, you can see that these three parameters also change with time. So then I was inspired by the resistive force theory initially developed to model swimming at low Reynolds number swimmers. So I came up with this hypothesis that if I can use a plate element that's moving in granular media independently and measure both vertical and horizontal force to calculate vertical and horizontal stress as a function of depth, orientation, and movement direction, then maybe I can integrate these stresses over a leg or foot of complex morphology and trajectory to calculate the net force. And such integration is in fact not trivial, because over here, when I make these measurements, the plate is moving independently, whereas these little elements on a leg or a foot are moving together, so the forces and flow around each element might affect those on other ones. And in fact, this integration does not work for high Reynolds number fluid for exact that reason. And to test my hypothesis, I decided to test the accuracy of my model using a robot because it's more precise and easier to control. So here is a video showing my experiment. So you can see I push this plate into granular media that's prepared and measure both vertical and horizontal stresses. And then I refluidize the particles to prepare it again and then extract the plate. Now in this region where the plate is far from boundary with no boundary effect and also fully immersed, I found that both vertical stress and horizontal stress, shown in blue and green, are proportional to depth. So I can then simply model these stresses using this simple equation. When the depth is greater than 0, then stresses are proportional to depth. And the slopes of these curves give me stress per unit depth. So here is one experiment with this given orientation and movement direction. And here are all the different orientation and movement direction that I have tested.
So the force is extremely low when you're pulling it out. Is it just at that point measuring the weight of the sand?
I don't think it's just the weight of the sand. If it's that, it should be constant. It shouldn't depend on depth.
Well, it would be lifting less and less as you're coming up, I guess. I don't know, maybe not. But it was extremely low, whereas
Yes.
the penetration
Yes,
was
yes.
extremely high.
Yes, yes. So in fact, that's one difference between granular media and fluid. In fluid, you won't see this anisotropic.
But it's sort of boundary effect issue, is it maybe? Or I'm just wondering why the major asymmetry?
I don't think it's the boundary effect. So in fact, let me go back to this video. So it's a little hard to see here, but I have done these measurements for all the cases where I find that there's always, like in front of the plate, in this direction of movement, there's always a region of material that will move together with the plate as the plate keeps moving, and they pretty much always fail at about a fixed angle, which is roughly the internal friction angle of the material. So as you go down, there's this material that there will be, from soil mechanics, that you will have a region with high stress underneath, but when you extract, the material will refill, but you will have some material that sits on top of the plate, but I don't think that's contributing to much of the force. There will be some material keep reflowing as you extract. I think the forces come mostly from this refill. Yeah, but the microscopic mechanism I haven't explored systematically. Although my colleague Ken Cameron at MIT, he has recently he used my experimental measurement and developed a finite element simulation using what's called the frictional plasticity, essentially kind of modeling these failure regions and made predictions which essentially matches my experiment. Yeah. Yeah. So here's what you would get using a horizontal plate penetrating vertically downward. You get this high vertical stress. So here I'm only showing vertical forces for simplicity. You get this high vertical stress using this horizontal plate going downward. And here's what you get everywhere else. So you can see that as soon as your plate orientation and movement direction deviates from the horizontal plate going downward, your vertical stress quickly decreases. And there's this very sensitive dependence on stress on both orientation and movement direction, which is not captured by previous models. Now, with my resistive force measurements, I can then see if I can indeed predict forces on the robot leg. So here again is the force measurement that I have shown earlier. I rotated this robot leg about a fixed axle through granular media. And here's the vertical force as a function of leg angle. And these dashed curves are what I get from integration of my stresses over the leg. And without any model fitting parameter, you can see that it captures measurements very well. So this is in the vertical direction. I can also do the same for horizontal forces. And again, my model captures measurements quite well. And here's what you would get if you simply use vertical stresses obtained with this single measurement. Because you are using the maximal stress, which is larger than the stresses everywhere else, you overestimate the lift on the robot leg. And that explains why you would then under predict sinkage. So now I have validated the predictive power of my model for predicting forces on the robot leg that would prescribe kinematics. Can I go one step further to predict the movement of a robot? So I developed this simple robot with 3D printed legs with which I can change leg shape. And with my lab mate, we developed a multi-body dynamic simulation of the robot in which each leg and body are divided into little elements. And then stresses are integrated on each body and leg element to obtain total force and torque. And those integrated forward in time gives the movement dynamics. And here are a slow motion video of the robot moving with these C-shaped legs on granular media, both in experiment and simulation using the resistive force theory. As you can see, the model captures the experiment very well. And here is the robot speed as a function of time to show the agreement. In addition, if I reverse the C legs, you can see now the robot slows down quite a bit, but the model can still capture the experiment very well. And in fact, this is the first model capable of predicting multi-legged movement on flowable ground. And I have validated the predictive power of my model over a wide range of leg curvature for this particular robot, and also over a wide range of leg frequency. And as you can see, over this wide range of parameter space, my model can predict the robot speed quite well. In addition, compared to doing experiments empirically or using the discrete element method to simulate particle-particle interaction, my model also has a practical benefit in that it reduces time by orders of magnitude. So what this means, what this gives us is the ability to then perform rapid design tests. For example, here, for this particular robot with a curved leg, I can predict its optimal leg curvature that generates the most rapid movement. Yes, Denise?
So when you say no fitting parameters, you mean you're using the same alpha on this linear curve in terms of depth, and you can do that because the legs are all sort of the same weight, or you're adjusting the alpha in your linear term in your model?
Oh no, I'm not adjusting. So for this particular granular media, these are my measurements of alpha, basically the stress per unit depth as a function of these two angles. So that in the robot, at any instant of time, I know its body position. I start with some initial condition. I know its body position, so I know where the leg is. So I divide the leg into little elements. So for each element, I know its depth, I know its orientation, I know its movement direction. Then I can calculate the forces using the stress, and I integrate over the leg.
There's a lookup table, basically.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, and in addition, because my model is based on integration of stresses, there's no reason it should not work on other locomotors, such as those using wheels. So, in fact, very recently, Carl Yakima at MIT, having seen my work, took his rover test bed and tested on my fluidized bed and found that indeed the resistive force theory predict the forces and sinkage quite accurately, and whereas the classical terramechanical models underpredict sinkage and overpredict forces. And finally, I have also validated my model for a variety of granular media that differ in particle size, particle shape, friction, compaction, and polydispersity, which is the distribution of particle size. And I found that, surprisingly, the dependence of these stresses on movement direction and orientation are similar. So these are plotted on different color scale. You can see that the shape are surprisingly similar. And further, I validated my model in predicting forces over this variety of granular media. So what this generality of my resistive force theory for level, uniform, and dry granular media gives us is a practical benefit. So now, because these stresses these stress dependencies are general, so one can then still use a single horizontal plate penetrating downward to measure the magnitude of the stresses here, and then infer the stresses for these other configurations and apply my model. So these measurements made in classical terramechanics are still useful. So now, so next I'll tell you my more recent work to expand terradynamics beyond flowable ground and into 3D multi-component terrain, where I discover the new concepts of terradynamic shapes that provide bio-inspired design principles. So for mobile robots to move into the real world and perform many essential functions, they need to often go through artificial terrain of high complexity with multiple three-dimensional obstacles that are often highly cluttered. And in fact, such scenarios have recently drawn attention from, for example, the DARPA Robotics Challenge, where people develop such courses to test the robot's mobility. Whereas small animals such as insects, arachnids, and reptiles live in such terrain, and in fact, they often prefer to go into this terrain to seek shelter. And going through such terrain is not a trivial problem, as you'll very soon see from this video. Just be prepared that staring at it might make you a little bit dizzy. So this is a video which I took using the small robot I showed earlier on Berkeley campus. You can see now the robot is going through dense vegetation and then crossing the street. And you saw a person just walk by. So in fact, these are really tiny obstacles that appear nothing for us to traverse. But for a small animal or robot, they become effectively a dense forest. And to begin to understand how animals solve such complex locomotor challenge, I looked at this discoid cockroach native to the tropical rainforest, which has to go through such terrain all the time. And analogous to what I did for flowable ground, here again, I pick a simple starting point, which is grass-like beams. And in the lab, I then create this device that allow me to precisely control and systematically vary the geometric and mechanical properties of the beams. So these are essentially paper laser cut into beams that allow me to change geometry. And I can also change the orientation as shown in this video. Now with my device, as a starting point, I studied how these cockroaches go through tall beams that are highly cluttered. So the lateral spacing of these adjacent beams are in fact less than half the animal body width. And here's a typical trial. You can see that the animal does a variety of things. This trial takes about 4 seconds, and you can see from the slow motion that the animal starts, runs into the beam, and tries to push forward using its horizontal body posture, and then pitches up and climbs, and finally falls with the beam and runs away. And here is the locomotor mode sequence of this particular trial. Among such diversity of locomotor mode, I found this one particular locomotor mode that's most effective, which is, as you can see, the animal pushes against the beam and then rolls its body towards the side to maneuver through the narrow gaps. And here is the locomotor mode sequence of this particular trial. Now here are the locomotor mode sequence of the two trials you have just seen. And if you run these poor animals near 200 times, here is what you get, a very complex locomotor transition diagram. The animal starts here and then uses one or a sequence of a variety of locomotor mode to finally traverse.
How do you use this hand scored? How do you, frame by frame, you decide what state it's in, or?
Yeah, so I recorded my entire experiment using webcams. And I have high-speed cameras that record typical representative trial, but the entire session is recorded with webcam. And yeah, so far I have been just looking at it manually. But in the future, I want to develop automated computer vision programs to do that. And in fact, such capability has already been achieved in simple 2D terrain, like people track animals walking, like fruit fly walking a dish. Yeah, so I wanted to expand that capability into this complex scenario. Yeah. So you can see that the move over here in such complex three-dimensional terrain, movement is no longer stereotyped, but rather statistical. These complex locomotor pathways towards traversal. But among such diversity of locomotor mode, so I want to point out that the thickness of these arrows are proportional to the transition probability. So you can then immediately see that among such diversity of locomotor pathway, there's this one using the side roll maneuver that's most probable about 2/3 of the time. In addition, if I quantify the traversal time, I find that when the animal takes this locomotor pathway, then it's fastest about 2 seconds. Whereas if the animal uses any of these other slower mode, then it takes about 5 seconds, significantly slower. Yes? I'll go to that in a minute. Yeah. So the most effective or the fastest pathway occurs most frequently. I'm curious to see how our robots compare. I then studied this robot, and you can see that the robot never traverses. Even when the gap between obstacles is larger than the robot body width, it only yaws and does not roll and becomes stuck. I'm curious why the animal is so much better. I compared them, and I found that the animal has this well-rounded shape resembling a thin ellipsoid, whereas the robot is highly angular with corners, straight edges, and flat faces. So in considering that here you are pushing against the media that pushes back against you, then I came up with a hypothesis that analogous to streamlined shape in fluid that reduce drag, here such well-rounded shape may be terradynamically streamlined and reduce terrain resistance. And I tested my hypotheses by giving my animals backpacks. Now you can see that by systematically reducing body roundness, the animals less and less frequently use this effective behavior, and that results in worse performance. And to get at your question, so after I did all these shape modifications, I tested the animal again without any backpacks and found statistically no change. So in this case, the animal is not learning. Yeah, I think that's because I'm really scaring them. They're just trying to get away. And now with this discovery, I can this then provides inspiration for robots. Here, for example, I added this rounded shell and enabled the robot to traverse simply using passive mechanics without any sensors or changes in control. I want to point out that such a high dependence of movement on shape is not specific to this one particular mode. In both animal and robot experiments, I found that when you have a less rounded shape, then they would pitch up more. And and also climb. So depending on your locomotor task, then you may choose shapes that are more appropriate. So there may exist broader concepts of terradynamic or even morphing shapes. And finally, I want to point out that the animal's performance is still far superior than the robot because they can traverse this gap that's much narrower than their body, whereas the robot only gaps that's barely narrow. And I think if you look at the animal movement, you can see that they're actively using their antennae, so very likely they're employing sensory motor feedback. So in future, I also want to look at this more in more detail to help robots. So in the last few minutes of my talk, I just want to quickly mention what I'll cover tomorrow in the Chalk Talk to create the next generation terradynamic model that enables statistical prediction of movement and understanding terradynamic shapes. So in my Chalk Talk tomorrow, I'll show you how I have begun to develop a simple locomotion energy landscape that will begin to allow me to predict movement statistically. Importantly, with my model, I found there's anti-correlation of the potential energy barrier with the probability of locomotive pathways. So I think this will provide a general framework to predict movement pathways statistically. And in fact, I have been selected as one of the 25 finalists for the Burroughs Wellcome Career Award, which I will be interviewing for next month. In addition, in my studies with undergraduate students studying how animals right themselves when they're upside down, I found similarly movement occurs through complex locomotive pathway that can begin to be understood by such potential energy landscape approach. So this may be a general framework. And also I have begun working with undergrad students, mostly mechanical engineering students, to begin to develop robots capable of self-riding inspired from animals. And this will in future help me further test these hypotheses. So finally, I want to point out that as you have seen, my approach integrating engineering, biology, and physics is not specific to certain types of animals or robots or terrain, but can be applied more generally. Also, with my integrative program, I'm in a strong position to seek funding from a variety of sources. My long-term vision is that complementary to approaches such as artificial potential field and virtual force field that have enabled autonomous vehicles to go through complex roadways. I envision that by looking at the contact mechanics of biological and robotic movement in a variety of artificial and natural terrain and even extraterrestrial terrain can allow me to create terradynamic maps that really enable autonomous movement where the contact with the terrain is essential. So to get there, I will partition the variety of terrain into subcomponents, and I have begun studying here and here, but there are many opportunities to go forward. And I see strong synergy with many people here in the mechanical engineering department, as well as the broader community at Johns Hopkins. Here are just some of the potential collaboration and interaction opportunities that I have seen, and I'm happy to explore in discussion with many of you here. So finally, I envision that in concert with aero and hydrodynamics, this emerging field of terradynamics will not only advance our understanding of biological movement in complex environment, but also advance mobile robots into the real world. But with that, I would like to thank the many people who have helped me over the years, particularly my advisors, Bob Full, Ron Fearing, and Dan Goldman, and my collaborators, my lab mates, my undergraduate mentees, colleagues, and facilities. And of course, I need to acknowledge my funding sources. And thank you all for your attention.
we have a couple quick questions. I know some of you may need to run 4 o'clock. That's okay, but we'll have time for just 2 or 3 questions.
Yes.
So the video of that lizard running was very interesting. So propulsion is one thing, and then stability is another.
Yes.
And I noticed that the tail of the lizard is kind of held up into the air. Is there any idea if there's some aerodynamics at play to help produce stabilization forces on the tail or something like that? You see the tail is kind of held up.
Yes. That's a great question. So I haven't looked at this systematically, but in my experiments, I think I need to quantify this to really say for sure. But from my observation, it seems that particularly on solid ground, when the animal runs faster, their tail seems to be held up higher. So yeah, and also I noticed that when they run faster, their body will pitch up more. So their forelimbs will start to lift out. They will start to run bipedally. So it is possible that the tail might be doing something to maintain balance. Yes, but in terms of aerodynamic drag, I can't say that. I need to do calculations.
More questions?
Yes.
At the end where you put the shape on the top of the bug to repeat it, but the comparison between the bug and the robot was the bug actually could roll,
Yes.
and you could do so with its legs, whereas your
Yes,
robot could only roll
Yes,
once
yes.
it ran into an obstacle and
Yes.
the geometry flipped it over.
Yes.
Isn't that a very big difference? If you
Yes,
compare
yes.
yourself to not-
Yes. That's in fact what I was trying to address. So if you look at the animal here, so here this gap, you can see here this gap is much narrower than the animal width and only barely wider than its thickness, but it can still do this 2/3 of the time very rapidly. Whereas the robot, even when I added the shell, you can see that here. This gap is about 80% of the shell width. So if I make it a little bit narrower, then the robot wouldn't be able to do it. And that's exactly because the robot cannot, like the animals can, like change their leg posture. The robots cannot do that. So when it starts to roll, the leg will in fact become stuck. So that's something I want to address in the future. So very likely the animal might be doing some sensory feedback and then adjust its leg posture. And even if you watch a bit more closely, the animal body has some flexibility over here. So it can bend this way, but also it can do some torsion, bending this way. So the animal might also be doing adjustments there to help initiate that roll. Yes.
That's a nice talk. You've been using sort of Rex-like robots,
Yes.
which have kind of an ad hoc design leg that is designed as kind of compromise early on in the project. And most of your work has been on trying to understand the interaction between the leg and the granular medium. So does this give you any insight into how, with that knowledge, could you design better legs and feet that would have better performance?
Yes. Yes. So in fact, I've shown that's just one example for this given robot. So you have seen that for this particular robot, if I have so here I have just one parameter, the curvature of the leg to vary leg shape, and here with my model, I can predict what's the best leg curvature to run fastest. But in principle, I can do this with more complex leg shape, leg design. And also, I showed earlier that my principal understanding can also allow control algorithm that's based on model to do control that can adapt to changing terrain. So I think, in principle, and that's in fact why I'm excited to work with many experts here in robotics to enable such capabilities using these predictive models. Yes.
Related to your modeling approach, I could be wrong, but one is left with the impression that it really captures forces and dynamic effects only of a subspace. Typically, as you showed in most of your pictures, a vertical slice
Yes, yes.
of the force as opposed to the full
Yes.
six-dimensional
Yes, yes.
forces and torques
Yes.
configuration.
Yes.
And you can imagine that both the wheel of the rover as well as the foot of the lizard,
Yeah.
these are three-dimensional objects
Exactly.
that can have different
Yes, yes.
configurations and maybe multiple contacts.
Yes, yes.
So how do you?
Yes, that's a great point. So, yeah, so you're right. In the cases I have shown, the movement is confined in the vertical plane. So the place that I'm moving in ground media also and the robot leg are wide enough such that the media moving below is well captured by this plate experiment. But you're right. For example, and that's in fact why I started testing my model on the lizard foot, and I found that it doesn't work as well, and that's exactly because of such limitations. For example, the animal feet, it spreads out, and each toe, the diameter of the toe is only a few particle diameter wide. So over there, the particle can no longer be well approximated using this continuum model. So it starts to deviate. In addition, so in terms of the full three-dimensional force measurements, I have not performed that, but I have done this vertical version, and also earlier working with my lab mates studying a lizard that swims in sand. I have also made these measurements in the horizontal plane, which is a much simplified version because over there, over here you have gravity, so that breaks symmetry when you move downward versus upward. It's different, but in horizontal plane, it simply depends on your angle of attack relative to movement direction. But in that case, we have also made these measurements and developed a model. But yeah, to really achieve comprehensive modeling of any 3D shape moving in any 3D trajectory, yes, you're right, that needs to be done. Yes.
Let me stop the questions here, and if people have more questions, they're welcome to come up afterwards and talk to Dr.